Hey, are you wanted to learn responsive layout and you want to learn CSS Grid? Then you are in the right place. Hello, my name is Jad Sarkar. I am full stack web developer and online instructor. In this tutorial, we are going to learn CSS Grid very beginning to advanced. So let's see what basically we are going to learn from it. CSS Grid is the new way to creating two-dimensional layout. That's give you the ability to create any modern layout with very easy way and short line of code. This course is for all front-end developer or a designer who creates components and layout using HTML and CSS. In this course, we are start from beginning to know the CSS Grid terminology, which are the bases that helps you, that you can learn CSS Grid very easily. And then I'm going to cover all the CSS Grid properties, such as grid display property, grid template column rows, grid units, grid gaps, grid autoflow, explicit and implicit grid lines, how to name the grid lines, how to name the grid area, repeat and min-max function, and how we can position grid items, grid item overlapping, and grid alignments. And also I'm trying to give you some challenges and projects with it. So what are you waiting for? Let's see what is CSS Grid. In this tutorial, I'm going to introduce you what is CSS Grid and how it's work and why should we use CSS Grid. The first benefit is it's a two-dimensional grid system. It's kind of new layout system. We call it two-dimensional because we can handle rows and columns together. Our second benefit is grid layout replace float layout. We don't need to use float property anymore, like margin, clear, and we don't need to focus on float left and float right. We can create layouts very easily. Our third benefit is it creates our code very fast and clean, because we don't need to focus on float properties, and it increases code readability. And our fourth benefit is we don't need to use any CSS framework like Bootstrap, Foundation, Materialize CSS, etc. Because if you understand Grid properly, then you don't need to use any framework, because you can handle all the things with CSS Grid. Let's try to understand how actually Grid works. Suppose this is a div, and inside this div we have 6 different divs, and we call this structure Grid System. Without using float and margin, we can provide gaps here, and we can handle it together. We call this parent container is Grid Container. To create this Grid Container, we need to use a CSS property in our parent div, which is display property, display grid. When we use display property grid, it automatically assumes this parent container as a grid container. And as you can see, all the items on this div, we call it grid items. Here you can see an individual div, we call it grid cell. And here you can see some lines between this div, and we call it grid line. Here you can see 4 grid lines. These are all vertical lines. And here you can see a gap between these two cells, we call it gutter. Similarly, these lines are working vertically. And as I told you, it's working two-dimensional, and we can handle it very easily. And it's work like table cells, row and columns. Here you can see, according to the structure, we have 2 grid row in our image. And here you can see in yellow borders, we call it grid columns. And here you can see a gap between rows and columns, and we called it grid area. So in our upcoming videos, we are going to understand how we can create grids. So in our upcoming video, I'm going to cover all the grid properties in this tutorial series. And we are also going to learn how we can create a beautiful layout using these grid properties. And here you can see the browser's name, which can support our grid system. Internet Explorer doesn't support grid system. Edge support it, Firefox support it, Chrome support it, Safari support it, and also Opera support it. Most of the time, we are work with Chrome, Safari, and Firefox. Hey, before we start our practical, let me show you something. If you want to learn CSS from the very beginning to advanced, then you can enroll this course. It's come with 100 and video and resources. Also, it's come with 31 plus hour content. It is the most complete course about CSS on Udemy. So if you are interested to learn, I will provide the link in the description. We are going to start the practical with 2 properties: grid template column and grid template row. Here you can see I already created a HTML document and I open this HTML document using live server extension. And in our right side, you can see our web browser. So first, I'm going to create a div where I'm going to create a grid container. Div. And also I'm going to assign a class to this div. Class container. And inside this div, I'm going to create 6 other divs. Div. And I'm going to set a class. Class item. And item 1. And I'm going to duplicate this div for 5 times. Here I use multiple classes and I'm going to change the class's name. Item 2, item 3, item 4, item 5 and item 6. And inside this div, I'm going to type some text. First, second, third, fourth, fifth, and last one is sixth. If I save this file, here you can see all the divs. First, second, third, fourth, fifth and sixth. So first, I'm going to set a background color to this container. Dot container background gray. If I save this file, here you can see the result. And also I'm going to assign a width to this container. Width 700 pixel. And also I'm going to provide margin to this container. Margin, for top I'm going to use 50 pixel. For left I'm going to use 0. For bottom I'm going to use 0. And for left I'm going to use 50 pixel. And if I save this file, here you can see the result. And now I'm going to provide different color for different items. So I'm going to create a selector. Dot item 1. And also I'm going to set a background to this item. Red. If I save this file, you can see the result. And now I'm going to duplicate this item multiple times. For item 2, I'm going to set orange color. For item 3, I'm going to set green color. For item 4, I'm going to set yellow color. For item 5, I'm going to set blue color. And for item 6, I'm going to set purple color. If I save this file, you can see the results. Here you can see all the color in our divs. So let's back to our parent div, which class is container. I'm going to use a property which is display. And I'm going to use display grid. If I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. Because we do not create row and column to this grid. First I'm going to create columns. So I'm going to use grid template column. Here we can mention how many columns we want. With that, we can mention column widths. Suppose I want 2 columns. Our first column is 200 pixel width and our second column is 250 pixel width. If I save this file, here you can see it's create our columns. Our first column take 200 pixel width and our second column take 250 pixel width. Here you can see in one row we create 2 columns. Suppose I want to change first column width, something 350 pixel. If I save this file, you can see the column width. Similarly, we can set height using another property. Let me show you. Grid template rows. Here we can define how many rows we want. Here you can see we have total 3 rows in our parent container div. For our first row, I want to set 100 pixel height. If I save this file, here you can see the result. It's applied for our first row only. And for our second row, I want to set 200 pixel height. And for our third row, I want to set 100 pixel height. If I save the file, here you can see the result. And if you notice, it doesn't affect our container width, which is 700 pixel. Not only that, we can add another column to this div. For this, first I'm going to reduce the value of this first column, 150 pixel. And for our third column, I'm going to take 150 pixel once again. 150 pixel once again. So if I save this file, here you can see the result. Now it creates 3 columns. And here you can see for our first row, it set height of 100 pixel. And for our second row, it set height of 200 pixel. And there is no third row in this container. And if we had third row in our container, it's going to set 100 pixel height. Let me show you. So I'm going to duplicate this item once again. And if I save this file, oops, sorry, we need to duplicate our div, not the selector. So if I duplicate this div and save this file, here you can see the result. Here you can see for our third row, it create 100 pixel height because we mentioned 100 pixel height for our third row. Here you can see a blank space. And now I want to fill this blank space with our third column. For this, we need to use a property which is auto. If I save this file, here you can see it fill the area with our last column. It's going to fill all the remaining space with our third column. Suppose I want to change our second column with 100 pixel. If I save this file, you can see the result. And if I use auto for our second column width and if I use this value for our third column width, and if I save this file, here you can see a result. Now you can see our first column take 150 pixel width and our last column take 100 pixel width and our blank space covered with second column because we use auto value for our second column. Let me show you one thing. If you use Firefox or Chrome browser, just press F12. It's open developer option in your browser. And if you highlight the container div, here you can see an option named Grid. And also you can see the properties here. Display Grid. And also you can see a grid icon here. It's called Grid Editor. If you click on it, here you can see a lot of options. For now, I'm not going to explain it. I will explain all the things later, so I close it. But if I click on this grid option, here you can see some line. And also you can see the line numbers. And we call it grid lines. It only possible if you use display grid property. Here you can see we use pixels, but we can use percentage also. Let me show you. Suppose I want to use two columns. For first column, I want to use 40%. And for our second column, I want to use 30%. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Our first column cover 40% area of our total width of container. And now I want to use third column. And for our third column, I'm going to use auto value. If I save this file, you can see the result. Our first column take 40%, our second column take 30%, and our third column also take 30%. Because our first and second column take 70%. And if I minus 70% from 100%, the remaining value is 30%. That's why it's take 30%. Not only that, we can use pixel with percentage. Suppose for our first column, I want to use 100 pixel. If I save this file, you can see the result. Our first column is 100 pixel and our second column take 30% of our container width and our third column cover the remaining space. Not only that, there is another unit which is FR, means fraction. Suppose I want two column of 1 FR and another one is 1 FR. If I save this file, here you can see it half our container div. Our first column take first half and our second column take our second half. And if I use another 1 FR value and save this file, here you can see it's create total 3 columns and all the columns take similar width. It's equally divide the container width, which is 700. And if I use 2 FR value for our third column and then save the file, here we can see our third column take 2 times space than our first column and second column. Here you can see we can control grids without using float. And next I'm going to use another property which is grid gap. Let me show you. And I'm going to use 15 pixel. And if I save this file, here you can see it's provide equal gap between rows and columns. If I click on this grid option, you can see it. Now you can see it clearly. In the next tutorial, I'm going to explain you clearly. And there is another unit which can we use as a grid template column value, which is repeat. Let me show you. Repeat is basically a function. Suppose you want 2 columns with equal width. So in our first parameter, we need to pass how many columns we want. In our case 2. And then you need to pass the width size, which is 150 pixel. If I set this file, here you can see the result. Here we don't need to type the width value multiple times. If we want 4 columns, just we need to type 4 here. If I save this file, here you can see the result. It creates 4 columns with same width. For now, I'm going to use 2 columns. With that, I want to use 1 FR column. Yes, we can do it. Just type 1 FR. If I save this file, here you can see the result. First it creates 2 equal size with column and then it covered the remaining space with our third column. Similarly, we can use percentage value and pixel value here. Let me show you. Suppose I want 40% column. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Similarly, we can use our fraction unit in our rows. Not only that, we can use fraction unit for our rows. But before, I'm going to set a height to our parent container. Height 700 pixel. If I save this file, here you can see the result. And now I want two rows with equal height. So I'm going to use repeat function, two rows with 1 fr height. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Here you can see it's equally divide our rows. This value is only applied for two rows, first and second. If I use 3 and then save the file, here you can see all the three rows are equally divided. Their height is equal. Similarly, we can use pixel value here. Suppose for our first row, I'm going to use 100 pixel. For our second row, I'm going to use 30%. And for our third row, I'm going to use 1 fr unit. If I save this file, here you can see the result. I hope now the concept is clear for you. These two properties are most important to create a grid structure. Our first property name is grid template column and our second property name is grid template rows. In our next tutorial, we are going to understand what is grid gap. We have total 3 property related grid gap. Our first property is grid row gap and our second property is grid column gap and last one is grid gap. Let's try to understand how grid gap property works. Here you can see a gap between grid items. We call it grid gap. If it comes with row wise, then we call it row gap. And if it comes with column wise, then we call it column gap. So let's start the practical and try to understand how it's work. Here you can see side by side I open my Visual Studio Code editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already created a HTML document in my directory. Here you can see we have total 2 grid columns with 1 fr value. And we have total 3 rows in our grid, 100 pixel, 150 pixel and 100 pixel. So between these items, I want to put a gap. Maybe row wise, maybe column wise. So first, I want to use row wise gap. So I'm going to use a property grid row gap. And I want to assign 10 pixel gap between these rows. Let me show you. 10 pixel. If I set this file, here you can see the result. Let's increase the value, 30 pixel. Here you can see the gaps between rows. You can increase the gap size how much you want. So this is row gap. And if you want to space between column wise, then you need to use grid column gap property. Let me show you. So I'm going to type grid column gap. And I'm going to use 20 pixel gap between columns. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Here you can see row gap is 30 pixel and column gap is 20 pixel. Not only that, we can use shorthand property for these two properties. For this, we need to use grid gap property. Let me show you. Gap. First, we need to pass row value and then we need to pass column value. For row, I'm going to use 20 pixel and for column, I'm going to use 30 pixel. If we use grid gap property, we don't need to use this property anymore. So I'm going to remove it. If I save this file, here you can see the result. The distance between row is 20 pixel and the distance between column is 30 pixel. And if I use equal value for row gap and column gap, 30 pixel for row and 30 pixel for column and save this file, here you can see the result. And now I want to show 3 column in our container. So I'm going to type 3, repeat column 3. If I save this file, here you can see the result. And also you can see the similar gap between grid items. And here you can see a blank space because we use 3 different row size. If I remove this one, last one, and save this file, now you can see there is no gap. Our first row height is 100 pixel and our second row height is 150 pixel. I hope now it's clear for you what is grid gap property.
Now let's talk about what is grid item positioning.
Here you can see a parent div and we called it grid container. and all the div inside the parent container, we called it grid items. Now the question is, what is the meaning of positioning? Suppose you want to move grid 3 item in 5th place, and also you decide to move 5th one is 3rd place. Something like that, and we called it grid positioning. As you can see, we moved the 3rd item in 5th place. Similarly, we moved the 5th item in 3rd place. So related this kind of alignment, we have some CSS properties. Let me show you. As you can see, we have total 7 CSS properties, like grid row start, grid row end, grid row, grid column start, etc. At last, we have a shorthand property named grid area. So let's jump into the Visual Studio Code Editor and try to understand how it's works. Here you can see I already created an HTML document and I open my browser and my code editor side by side. If I show you, here you can see we have a parent container, and inside this parent container we have total 6 div. It's mean 6 grid items. As you can see, every grid item color is different. At first, I'm going to move the first grid item into the 6th place, and similarly I'm going to move the 6th grid item into the 1st place. As you can see, we already create our selectors, item 1, item 2, item 3. As I told you earlier in this tutorial series, we have a browser option in our console, which is grid lines. Let me show you. Just select your browser and press F12, mean developer mode. And I'm going to open this panel bottom of my browser. So I'm going to press this option. Here you can see an option in my parent container, which is grid. If I click on it, here you can see some lines. Now you can see grid line numbers. You can see it row wise, also you can see it column wise. In this tutorial, we are going to understand what is the use case of these lines. So let's jump into our first item selector, which is item 1. As I told you, I'm going to move this first item in 6th position. So at first, I'm going to use a property which is grid row start. So at first, we need to move this grid item in 2nd row. As you can see, this is our 2nd row. So I'm going to type 2 here. If I save this file, now you can see our first grid item move into the 2nd row. And also, we need to declare the end position. For this, we need to use another CSS property, which is grid row end. Now once again, if I show you my grid lines, here you can see our end position is 3. That's why we need to pass 3. If you do not use grid row end property, maybe it creates some trouble when you responsive your website. If I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. But it is good manner to use this property. And now we need to work with columns. As you can see, we need to move this grid item 3rd position. For this, I'm going to use another CSS property, grid column start. And here, I'm going to set 3. If I save this file, you can see the result. We successfully move our first grid item in 6th place. And also, we need to declare the end position of this column, grid column end. As you can see, our row end in 4th position. So we need to pass 4. If I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. It's not mandatory, but for responsive purpose, it's very important. And now I want to move this 4th item in 1st position. For that, I'm going to copy this code. And I'm going to jump into our 4th item selector. And I'm going to paste the code. So our starting row is 1st. So I'm going to type 1. And our ending row is 2. Similarly, as you can see, our column start with 1 and end with 2. So I'm going to type column start 1 and column end 2. If I save this file, here you can see the result. We successfully move our 4th container in 1st place. But the important thing is we do not change our HTML structure. Here you can see our HTML structure. Using CSS Grid properties, we can change their positions without changing their actual structure. And now I'm going to show you shorthand method all of these properties. And now I want to move the 5th item in 1st place. So I jump into the 5th item selector and then I'm going to use a different CSS grid property. If you want to create shorthand for row, then we need to use grid row property. Let me show you. Grid row. First we need to provide the starting row position, which is 1, and then we need to use slash, and then we need to provide ending row position, which is 2. Similarly, we have shorthand property for column, which is grid column. Let me show you. Our columns start with line number 1 and end with line number 2. If I save this file, here you can see we successfully move our 5th grid item in first place. But what about 4th grid item? We do not remove 4th grid item from this container. It still exists in the first place. Just item 5 overlap the 4th one. That's why we cannot see the 4th one. Not only that, we have another shorthand of this property. Using this shorthand, we can pass 4 value at once, which is grid area. Let me show you. Suppose I want to move the 6th item in second place. For this, we need to provide row starting point and column starting point. So, our row starting point is 1 and our column starting point is 2. And then we need to provide row endpoint and column endpoint. Our row endpoint is 2 and our column endpoint is 3. If I save this file, here you can see we successfully move our 6th container in second place. Just we need to use one CSS grid property, which is grid area. Just you need to remember, first you need to provide row starting point and then you need to provide column starting point. And next, you need to provide row ending point and you need to provide column ending point. I hope now it's clear for you how row and columns are work. There are a lot of methods we can position our grids. In my upcoming videos, I'm going to teach you all of them. In our next tutorial, we are going to learn how can we span our grid items. Suppose you want to span your 3rd item width. I just want to fill this blank area with this 3rd item. Means it's going to take 2 column width. And we call this method span.
Now let's see what is grid item spanning.
Here you can see a grid container, and inside this grid container we have total 6 items. If you notice, you can see every div item width is same. And now I want to extend div 1 width. I want to extend item number 1 up to 2 item. Similarly, I want to extend item 2 row wise. Something like this. For item 1, we use column span, and for item 2, we use row span, and other items automatically arranged at its own place. So let's start the practical and try to understand how it's work. Here you can see, side by side, I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Light Server extension. And as you can see, we have total 6 grid items in our parent container, and we arrange it serially. Let's turn on the grid lines. So I'm going to press F12. And if I click on this option, you can see the grid lines. And now I want to span our first item column wise. And I want to extend this column up to line number 3. So I'm going to type grid column end 3. And you already know that item 1 is our first item. So if I save this file, here you can see the result. We successfully span our first grid item column wise. And if you notice, you can see all the grid items automatically change their places. You can see that item number 6 has came down, and we do not specify any height to our 3rd row. That's why it looks small. So now I'm going to specify height for this 3rd row, 100 pixel. If I save this file, now you can see the result. Our first row height is 150 pixel and our second row height is 150 pixel, but our 3rd row height is 100 pixel. And once again, I'm going to turn on my grid lines. And now I want to extend our second item row wise. And I want to extend it from this point to this point. Means 4. For this, we need to work with these 2 properties. So I'm going to copy these properties and paste it here. And I'm going to change grid row endpoint, which is 4. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Now it's look like a web page. This is our header and this is our sidebar. Not only that, we can use shorthand property for this. Let me show you. Grid row. If I comment out this two property, and if I type 1/4, and if I save this file, here you can see the same result. There is no changes. I hope now it's clear for you how spannings are work. Let me show you one thing. Here you can see we have total 3 columns with 1 FR value. So for this example, I'm going to comment out this property. And once again, I'm going to turn on the grid lines. Here you can see we have total 4 column line in our structure. But what happened if we pass 5 value here? If I save this file, here you can see it extend our column with default value. Now we have total 4 column in our container. But here you can see we do not declare 4 column. We just declare only 3 column. So we can extend our grid item beyond the container. Then it automatically arranges the grid item according to the fraction value. But this is not the good practice. So I'm going to use 4. And if I save this file, you can see the result. And now I'm going to fix the third item in his absolute position. For this, inside the item 3 selector, I'm going to type grid row. And also I'm going to turn on the grid lines. Our third item starts from row number 2 and end up to row number 3. And our next property is grid column. And also it starts from column number 2 and end at column number 3. If I save this file, you can see there is no changes. So this is the absolute position of third item. Now I cannot move this grid from this place. And now I want to extend second column width up to line number 3. For this, I'm going to use grid column property. And our column starts from line number 1 and end at line number 3. If I save this file, here you can see a different result. Because we already placed our third div in that position, so our second grid item cannot take its place. Then it's automatically shrink down. But if you notice, you can see we use only grid column property. We do not use grid row property. If I use grid row property, let me show you. Row, and try to move this item in this place. Let me show you. But first, I'm going to turn on the grid line. So our row starts from line number 2 and end up to line number 3. If I save this file, now you can see a different result. Now it's overlap each other. If you want to see the second item completely, then you need to use z-index property. Let me show you. So I'm going to type the property name, z-index. By default, it's come with 0. So I'm going to type 1. If I save this file, now you can see the second item width completely. Our third item still exists behind the second item. And now I'm going to show you the different value that we use for spanning, which is span. Let me show you. So I'm going to type span, and I want to span our first item up to 4 column. Span space 4. If I save this file, sorry, we don't have 4 column in our container. That's why it extends our column and create a new grid line. For that, we need to use span 3. If I save this file, now we back to our old result. If I show you the grid lines, here you can see we have total 4 lines. This value work with grid item numbers, and this value work with grid line numbers. This is the main difference between two values. And also we can span it row wise. Let me show you. Span 2. If I save this file, now we span our first container row wise, also column wise. And because we use z-index property for our second item, that's why our first item do not cover the second item. I know it's little complicated, but I am trying to explain it very simply. Not only that, we can use this value with this different value. Let me show you. Span 2. If I save this file, here you can see the result. For now, I don't need it, so I'm going to undo it. And also I'm going to change the grid row end value. just 2. And once again, I'm going to turn on the grid lines. Suppose we have lot of columns in our container, and I want to extend the red grid item from beginning to end of this container. But I don't know how much column line we have. For this, we can use minus points. Here you can see a line number -1. Remember, our last line number always start with -1. So we can use the minus value here. Let me show you. If I type -1 and save this file, here you can see there is no changes. So I hope now it's clear for you how spannings are work.
Now let's talk about what is grid line naming.
In our previous tutorial, we used grid lines to span our grid items. But in this tutorial, we are going to learn how can we assign line name and how can we use the line name as value. Let me simplify it. This is our header item and this is our sidebar item. To create this sidebar item, we need to use grid row property and grid column property. And in grid row property, first we need to pass line starting point and then we need to pass line ending point. But in this tutorial, we don't going to use line numbers. We are going to create our own value name. As you can see, for starting point, I use sidebar start, and for end point, I use sidebar end. So let's start the practical and see how it's work. Here you can see, side by side I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already created a HTML document for this example. And here you can see a web layout, which I create using grids. Here you can see a header, a menu bar for different boxes, and a sidebar, and last a footer. And here you can see the container and all the div inside this container. And I create this layout using spanning. So let's jump into the container div selector. Here you can see we have total 3 grid column with 1 FR value. And also you can see we have total 5 row with different sizes. For header, I use 150 pixel height. For menu bar, I use 50 pixel height. And for our third row, once again I use 150 pixel height. And for footer, once again I use 50 pixel height. And here you can see I span my header from beginning to end, from 1 to -1. And here you can see we use grid line value for that. So I'm going to turn on my grid lines using developer mode. And you can see the line numbers. This is not a very complex template, but sometimes we need to face difficult templates or a very complex template. In that case, it's very difficult to remember these numbers and it can create very big problems. So to resolve this kind of problem, we assign a name to these lines and we call this process grid line naming. So let's see how it's work. So first, I'm going to start with rows and we need to assign these line names with these values. So for grid line number 1, I'm going to use a name which is header start. Let me show you. So first, I'm going to use square braces. Inside the square braces, I'm going to assign a name for our first line, header dash start. Just you need to remember you cannot provide space between two words. And I'm going to turn on word wrap. Otherwise, you cannot see my lines. You can use hyphens, underscore, or any other character. And if we start this header, also we need to end this header. And I want to end this header in row number 2. So I want to use square braces once again. And inside the square braces, I'm going to type header end. Header end. So if I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. And now I'm going to show you how can we use these names in our value. So in our grid row property, I'm going to type header start because this is our starting point. And for our endpoint, I'm going to use header end value. So if I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. So our names are worked properly. So let's jump into the menu section. Let's create a starting point for menu. For this, we don't need to use another square braces. Just we need to use a space between header end and menu start point. For menu start point, I'm going to use menu start. I'm going to use menu start name dash start. And to end this menu after 50 pixel, I'm going to use menu end name, menu dash end. And I'm going to use these names in our grid row properties. Let me show you. So I'm going to copy the menu start name and I'm going to replace 2 with this name. And for our menu end value, I'm going to use menu end name. If I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. It's worked very perfectly. Similarly, you can take names for all the rows. These line namings methods are very helpful when we work with complex layouts. And now I'm going to name our columns. Here you can see we have total 3 columns. But if you notice, you can see we use repeat value here. And I use 1FR value for 3 columns. So how can we assign name for repeat values? There is 2 methods you can assign name for your columns. Either you type 1FR 3 times and every time you use these brackets. Otherwise, we can assign name with this repeat value. Let me show you. So before 1FR value, I'm going to use a name, which is call dash start. And after 1FR value, I'm going to type call end. You can type any name as you want. But there is a problem. It's going to use call start and call end 3 times. First, it's going to use call start here, and then it's going to use call end here. Once again, it's going to use call start here, and then it's going to use call end here. And it's keep going on. So how can we use it properly? For this, first we need to type call start. And then we need to assign from where our columns start. Our columns start from 1. So I'm going to type 1. And for endpoint, I'm going to use call end. Call dash end. Because I span up to 3 columns, so I'm going to use 3 here. You don't need to notice line number here. Just you need to notice how many columns you want to use. So if I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. So there is no problem. It's worked perfectly. And now I want to span our header up to 2 columns. So I want to use 2 here. If I save this file, you can see the result. It used 2 column value for header item. So I want to back to my old position. So I'm going to use 3. We can use the same value for our menu columns. Let me show you. So I'm going to copy the value and I'm going to replace with this one. Because our menu item takes same amount of column area, that's why we can use this value. If I save this file, you can see there is no changes. So in that way, you can assign any name for your lines and you can use it multiple times. So I hope the concept of grid line namings is clear for you.
Next, we are going to talk about what is grid area naming. We use this method to position our grid items.
So let's see what type of properties we have that we can use for positioning. Our first property is grid template areas and our second property is grid area. So let's start the practical and try to understand how it's work. Here you can see in our previous tutorial we create a basic layout using grid properties. And here we assign names for grid lines. And using these names, we position our item and span our items. And now I am going to create the same template without using grid row property and grid column property. And we don't need to use line names for that. Here you can see I have another HTML file, grid area HTML. And I'm going to use this template. At first, we divide this grid into a 3 column with 1FR value. And we already have 5 rows. For header, for menu, for boxes, and for footer. And now I'm going to assign a different name for every grid item. And for this, I'm going to use grid area property. And inside this grid area, you can take any name. So I'm going to use same name for that, which is header. And we don't need to use inverted quotes for that. And similarly, I'm going to use the same property for every grid item. For menu, I'm going to use the same name, menu. And for box, I'm going to use box 1. For box 2, I'm going to use box 2. For box 3, I'm going to use box 3. Similarly, for box 4, I'm going to use box 4. And for sidebar, I'm going to use the same name, which is sidebar. And for footer, I'm going to use footer. So if I save this file, here you can see everything is disappeared. Because we do not use any positioning, that's why items are gone. So in our parent div, I'm going to use a new property. Let me show you. and our property name is grid template areas. Grid template areas. And inside this grid template areas, I'm going to use double quotes. Let me show you one thing. So I'm going back to my old file. Here you can see my previous layout. If I press F12 and turn on grid lines, here you can see we have total 3 columns in our structure, and our header section use 3 columns for that. So I'm back to my new layout, and here I'm going to use this header name 3 times. Let me show you. So I'm going to copy the name and I'm going to paste it here. Header, header, and header. For 3 columns, I use this name for 3 times. And if I save this file, here you can see the result. But if you notice, it leaves a blank page because it expects 6 rows in our grid structure. And here we just use 1 row. And once again, if I show you my old layout, here you can see our menu also use 3 columns. So, inside the double quotes, I'm going to use menu name for 3 times. And if I save this file and show you my layout, here you can see the result. And once again, I'm back to my old layout. Here you can see, in our first column, we use box 1. In our second column, we use box 2. And in our third column, we use sidebar. So I'm going to duplicate this line. And for our first column, I'm going to use box 1 name. And for our second column, I'm going to use box 2 name. And for our third column, I'm going to use sidebar name. We use these column names for our third row. And once again, I'm going to duplicate this line. And here you can see our fourth row start with box 3, then come box 4, and then come sidebar once again. So I'm going to type box 3, box 4, and then come sidebar. And in our last row, here you can see we use 3 columns for our footer. So I'm going to use this footer name 3 times. F-O-O-T-E-R, footer, footer, and footer. And semicolon to end this line. And if I save this file and show you my layout, here you can see we successfully create our old layout without using grid row and grid column property. So this is the second method that we can using to position our grid items. Just we need to use 2 properties for that. Our first property is grid area and our second property is grid template areas. So this kind of positioning technique is very useful for small projects. If your layout is not complex, then you can use this process. But if your project is more complex and big, I don't recommend to use this process. And if you notice, here you can see we use 3 column names for every row. And if I remove one of the column name, any of the row, so I'm going to remove menu. And if I save this file, here you can see everything is gone. Because we use 3 column, that's why we need to pass 3 column name. So if I save this file once again, here you can see now it's look perfect. And now, suppose you want to use 2 column for menu section. In that case, you need to pass dot here. If I save this file, now it's work. And if you want to use menu item only in second column, in that case, just you need to pass another dot before the menu. Dot menu dot. If I save this file, you can see the result. We can align our grid item and we can position our grid item just using dots. But you cannot use this dot middle of these 2 columns. Let me show you. If I remove header from this place and use a dot and save this file, it can destroy your layout. So once again, I'm going to repeat this process how it's work. At first, you need to use a property name grid area for every grid item, and then you need to assign a name. You can use any name for that. And then inside the parent container selector, you need to use a property which is grid template areas. And then you need to remember how many columns you assign to this grid structure. According to my layout, here you can see I use 3 columns. So in every row, we need to pass 3 value. And here you can see we span our sidebar row wise also. That's why I use this sidebar name in row number 3 and row number 4. So I hope now you understand what is grid area naming.
Now let's talk about CSS Grid Min Max function. Using this function, we can dynamically change rows and columns height.
In this tutorial, we are going to learn 2 other values without min max. First one is max content and second one is min content. So let's see how we can change height and width dynamically. Here you can see side by side I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already create a HTML document. And as you can see inside my parent container we have 8 different grid cells. And we declare 4 columns for our grid cells with 1FR values. And we also have 2 rows with 175 pixel height. So let's start the practical. As you can see in my first grid item, there is a text named first. So I'm going to insert more text inside this grid item. Lorem 20. It's going to add 20 words inside this grid item. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Let me reduce some words. And then I'm going to save this file. Here you can see it breaks down our lines according to width of this grid item. But what happened if I use max content value for our first column? Let's use it. So I'm going to use max content value for our first column. If I save this file, you can see the result. Here you can see there is no line break for this paragraph. And also it overflow from the container width size. If we use this value, it do not going to break our lines. It's going to print all the paragraph in one line. It's not a very useful thing for our real projects. So I'm going to reduce some word from this paragraph. And then I'm going to save this file. Let's reduce some more words. Now it's look perfect. And now I'm going to add some more text in our fourth content. Lorem 10. And I'm going to save this file. And then I'm going to use our next value for this column, which is min content. And if I save this file, here you can see the result. It dynamically changes the width according to the biggest word of this sentence. And also I'm going to add more text in this item. Let's add more text. Lorem 8. If I save this file, here you can see our text overlap the grid item. To solve this kind of problem, we can add minimum content value in our row. Let me show you. So I'm going to remove 170 pixel value and here I'm going to type min content value. If I save this file, now you can see it set the grid item height according to the text area. Suppose I want to add 50 word paragraph in our 7th item. So I'm going to jump into the 7th item and I'm going to type lorem 50. If I save this file, here you can see according to the text size, it's change height and width. It's going to consume minimum height and minimum width according to this text. That's why this value name is min content. And now I want to fix the minimum height of our row. So I'm going to remove some word from this text. And then I'm going to save this file. And now I'm going to use min max function to set a fixed height. Let me show you. So I'm going to use min max function here. Min max. And inside this parenthesis, and here we need to pass the two value for minimum size of row and for maximum size of row. Suppose our minimum row height is 175 pixel. And for maximum, I'm going to use min content property. Because I want to change the height according to this content size. If our content take more than 170 pixel height. So if I save this file, here you can see by default our row come with 170 pixel height. But as you can see in our first row, it take more than 170 pixel height. Because it content size take more than 170 pixel. And for our maximum value, we use main content. That's why it can take as much height it want. Min max function is very useful for our rows. Here we set minimum value for our item height. But if our content take more height, then we can use main content value as maximum value. But what happened if I set 200 pixel maximum height? Let me show you. If I save this file, here you can see by default our second row take 175 pixel height. But our first row extend up to 200 pixel and then our content overflow from this item. That's why we refer to use main content as max size. Main content. Now it can hold the all content in our row. And now I'm going to use min max function as a column value. Let's use it. So for our first column, I'm going to use the min max function. And I'm going to set a minimum width of this column, which is 150 pixel. And also I'm going to take 200 pixel for max width. And here you can see we already set maximum container width, which is 700 pixel. But I'm going to use percentage value in this place, 80%. And it's going to make our web page more responsive. And if I save this file, here you can see the result. Let's add more content to our first column. Lorem 6. Here you can see our first column take maximum width of 200 pixel. If I increase the maximum width size 300 pixel and then save this file, now you can see the changes. By default, it's going to take 150 pixel width and it can extend up to 300 pixel. And after that, it's going to break down our lines. And now I'm going to use 200 pixel for our minimum width. And if I turn on my developer option and I select this content, here you can see the maximum width of this content is 300 pixel. And if I try to make it responsive and then I select this item, here you can see the minimum width of this item is 200 pixel because we already set a minimum size to this column. Similarly, if we scale up our window, let me show you. And then select this item, you can see it cannot extend the width more than 300 pixel. So I hope now it's little clear for you how it's work. And if I use percentage value in our maximum size, let me show you. 60%. And then save this file. Now you can see a different result. It's going to take 60% width of this container. Here we can use percentage value, FR value, pixel value, etc. But if I reduce the browser size, and then it's going to stop at 200 pixel width, we cannot scale down our first column more than 200 pixel. So I hope now it's clear how main value and max value are worked.
Now let's talk about implicit and explicit grid. What is that?
Here you can see side by side I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And as you can see in my parent container, we have total 8 grid cells. So at first I'm going to set width and height. So at first I'm going to use grid template column value. Grid template columns. And I'm going to create 2 columns with 1 FR value. For this I'm going to use repeat value. Repeat 2 columns with 1 FR value. If I save this file, you can see the result. And also I'm going to set row height. For this I'm going to use grid template row property. But I'm going to set 3 rows height from this 4 row. So I'm going to use repeat value once again. Repeat 3 row, comma, 100 pixel value. If I save this file, you can see the result. And also I'm going to provide gap between these cells. So I'm going to type grid gap property 20 pixel. If I save this file, you can see the result. So here you can see we just defined 2 column size and 3 row size. But we have total 8 cells in this structure. We do not style our 7th grid item and 8th grid item. Suppose we dynamically extract the data from the server and I want to show this data in our 7th and 8th column. For this, we need to set height. But we already defined height using grid template rows property. So what are these columns? How can we set height to these columns? Let me show you something. If I press F12 and show you my developer toolbar and click on this grid icon, here you can see some grid lines. As you can see, we style 3 row and 2 columns and we call this structure explicit grid because we explicitly define this area using these 2 property, and this one that we not defined and we called it implicit grid. So to style this implicit grid, we have some new properties. Let's see it. Here you can see we have total 3 property related implicit grid. Our first one is grid auto rows, our second one is grid auto columns, and our last one is grid auto flows. So let's start the practical and try to understand how it's work. So after grid gap, I'm going to use our new property which is grid auto rows. So I'm going to type grid auto rows. Here we can define our implicit grid row height. So for our implicit item, I'm going to define 50 pixel height. So if I save this file, now you can see, now the implicit grid item height is 50 pixel. So if we add more cell to this container, let me show you. So I'm going to duplicate this line 2 times and save this file. Now you can see it automatically set 50 pixel height for these grid items. So for now, I'm going to delete these columns. I don't need it. And save this file. So here you can see when we add a new cell, it's going to add row wise. But now I want to add a new cell column wise. For that, we need to use another value, which is grid auto flow. So I'm going to type grid auto flow. It's come with 2 type of value, row and column. By default, it's work with row, but here I'm going to use column. So if I save this file, now you can see the result. Because we already defined 3 row in our explicit grid, then after 3 row, it's going to add all the cells item column wise. And here you can see we do not define any column size to this grid item. It's take width according to this text size. And now I want to assign width to our implicit grid. For that, we need to use a property which is grid auto columns. And here I am going to provide 0.5 FR value for our implicit grid. So if I save this file, here you can see the result. Our explicit grid columns take 1 FR value and our implicit grids column take half FR value. And if I add some more column to this container, let me show you. And then save this file. Now you can see it's also take 0.5 FR value according to this grid item. So this is our implicit grid and explicit grid.
Now let's talk about what is CSS Grid Items Alignment.
In our previous video, we learned about how can we create layouts using CSS Grid items and how we can position these items. But in this tutorial, we are going to learn about horizontal alignment and vertical alignment. We have total 6 property related CSS grid alignment: align item, justify item, place item, align self, justify self, and place self. So let's start the practical and try to understand how it's work. Here you can see side by side I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already created a HTML document named index.html. And here you can see we have total 10 grid items. Our first 6 grid items are explicit grid item and our last 4 grid items are implicit grid items. And here you can see our explicit grid item height is 100 pixel and our implicit grid item height is 50 pixel. And now I want to span my 5th grid item and I want to span it row wise. For that, I'm going to jump into the item 5th selector, and here I'm going to use a CSS property which is grid row. And here I'm going to span this item up to 2 row. So I'm going to type span and then I'm going to pass 2. If I save this file, you can see the result. And here you can see our 10th grid item and I want to span this grid item column wise. So I'm going to jump into the item 10 selector and here I'm going to use a CSS property which is grid column. So I'm going to type grid dash column and I want to span it up to 2 column. So if I save this file, you can see the result. So here we span our item row wise and here we span our item column wise. So let's start the alignment. So at first I'm going to cover vertical align. For that we need to use align item and align self property. And these properties are came with 4 values. Let me show you. First one is start, end, center and stretch. If we use start value, it's going to place our content start of this container, means in that place. And if we use end value, it's going to place our content in that place. And if we use center, it's going to place our content center of this grid item. And stretch is our default value. So once again, I'm back to my Visual Studio Code editor. And now I'm going to jump into the parent container. So first, I'm going to use a CSS value, which is align items. So I'm going to type align items. So I'm going to use our first value, and our first value is center. If I save this file, here you can see it align our content center. And this is our vertical alignment process. If I show you my grid lines, here you can see it clearly. As you can see, this is our grid item. And this is the content inside this grid item. And as you can see, it places our content middle of this item because we use align item center. But what happened to our fifth item? According to this line, it align our content end of this grid item. But it is not. Because we span our fifth grid item, that's why it used two items. And according to item, it center the content. And also you can see the same alignment for our implicit grid items. And now I'm going to use end value. So I'm going to type END. If I save this file, now you can see the alignment. Here you can see it align our content end of this item. Similarly, if we use start value, let me show you. And then save this file, you can see the alignment. Here you can see it align our content start of this item. And our last align item value is stretch. Let me show you. If I use this value and save this file, it's a default alignment positioning. It's not very important one. It's a default value. So for now, I'm going to use center value. And now I'm going to talk about align self. What is align self? Here you can see all the item content are aligned center. And now I decide to align our third grid item differently. I want to use align end value for this third item. So I'm going to jump into the third item selector. And for this kind of alignment, we need to use align self property. So I'm going to type align self. And here I'm going to use end value. If I save this file, you can see the result. If I turn on my grid lines, here you can see all the contents are aligned in center, but our third grid item align at end. We can use this property only in individual cell, not for the whole container. So now it's clear for you, if we want to apply alignment all these items, for that we need to use align item property. And if we want to apply in individual items, for that we need to use align cell property. And now I'm going to talk about horizontal alignment. For horizontal alignment, we need to use two property, justify item and justify cell. It works similar to our previous one. And we need to use same value for that. Start, end, center and stretch. So let's start the practical. So once again, I'm back to my Visual Studio Code editor. And I'm going to jump into the parent container. And now I want to align our content horizontally centered. For that, we need to use a property, which is justify item. And our value is center. If I save this file, here you can see the result. And if I turn on my grid lines, you can see it clearly. It horizontally center our content. And similarly, if I use different value, end, and then save this file, now you can see the result. Now you can see the content end of this grid item. Similarly, we have another value, which is start. And if I save this file, you know the result. It horizontally align our content start of this grid item. If you want to move your content left side, then you need to use start. And if you want to move your content right side, then you need to use end. And as you know, stress is our default value, so I don't going to explain it here. And now I'm going to talk about justify cell property. Suppose you horizontally center your first item. For that, we need to use justify cell property. Let me show you. So here I'm going to use justify cell property. And I'm going to use center value. If I save this file, you can see the result. And if I turn on my grid lines, you can see it clearly. If you need to align your content individually, you can use justify cell property. And similarly, you have total 3 value for that: center, start and end. And now I want to talk about 2 new properties: place item and place cell. Place item is a shorthand of align item and justify item. If you want to use this value in one line, then you can use it. In this property, first you need to pass align item value and then you need to pass justify item value. And between them, you need to provide a space. Similarly, we have place cell property. This is for individual grid items. First, you need to pass align cell value and then you need to pass justify cell value. So let's see the practical how it's work. So once again, I'm back to my Visual Studio Code editor. For now, I'm going to comment out these two lines. So first, I'm going to use place item property. So I'm going to type place items. And as you know, first we need to pass align item value and then we need to pass justify items value. Our first value is center. And our second value is start. And now I'm going to save this file. If I save this file, here you can see the same result. There is no changes. You can use this value this way or that way. It's totally on you. And next, let's see how place cell value is work. As you know, it's work individually. So in our item 2, I'm going to use this property. Place cell. First we need to pass align cell value and then we need to pass justify cell value. So I'm going to provide center. And our justify cell value is also center. If I save this file, you can see the result. It centers our content horizontally and vertically. So I hope now it's clear for you how place self and place items are work. In this tutorial, we are going to learn about CSS Grid track alignment. To alignments our track, we have total 3 property: align content, justify content, and place content. And place content property is a shortened version of align content and justify content property. So let's try to understand what is grid item track. Here you can see side by side I open my Visual Studio Code editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already created a HTML document named index.html. And here I'm going to use the same grid structure which I used in my previous tutorial. Here you can see total 10 grid items. And as you can see, we span our 5th grid item row wise. And we also span our 10th grid item column wise. So at first, I'm going to reduce the column width. Let me show you. So I'm going to reduce one effort value and I'm going to type 150 pixel. And if I save this file, you can see the alignment. And also I'm going to increase the container height. So I'm going to use height property. Height 750 pixel. If I save this file, you can see the space. And now I'm going to show you how can we use align content and justify content. But first, we need to understand what is justify content. We use justify content for horizontal alignment. And we have total 7 value related justify content: start, end, center, stretch, space around, space between, and space evenly. Our last 3 value are used for content property. So let me show you how it's work. So once again, I am back to my Visual Studio Code editor. So at first, I'm going to turn on my grid lines. So I'm going to press F12. And then I click grids. And here you can see the grid lines. And now I'm going to use the justify content value. And at first, I'm going to use center value. If I save this file, you can see the result. Here you can see all the grid items all together move to the center of this container. Using justify item property, we can center our content inside these items. And using justify content property, we can align our grid items inside the container. Using justify content, we can move the whole track. Similarly, we have another value, which is end. If I save this file, you can see the result. Horizontally, it moves our grid items end of this container. And start is our default value. Let me show you. If I save this file, you can see the result. And now I'm going to talk about our 3 new values. Our first value is space between. So I'm going to type space between here. If I save this file, you can see the result. If we use space between value, then it's going to provide the remaining space between our grid items. As you can see, it split our grid items end to end. But if you have 3 columns, let me show you. So I'm going to pass 3 here. And then save this file. Here you can see the result. As you can see, it put our second column center. And it split our blank space 2 parts. And for now, I'm going to use 2 columns. Our next value is space around. Let me show you. If I save this file, here you can see the result. If we use this value, as you can see, first it provides a space, then our grid item, and then you can see the similar size of space 2 times, and then once again our column and a blank space. So you can see the equal space left and right, and also you can see the same amount of space after first column. Similarly, you can see the space before the second column. So you can see the more space in center. And our next value is space evenly. So I'm going to type space evenly. If I save this file, here you can see it's pretty similar to space around value. But there is a basic difference. The main difference is you can see the same amount of space between our grid items. If the space size is 1FR, you can see the same amount of space before and after the column. So this is our justify content property. We basically use it for horizontal alignment. And this property works with grid tricks. So let's talk about align content value. We use align content property for vertical alignment. And as you can see, there are total 7 values for this property. Start, end, center, stretch, space around, space between, and space evenly. And we already know about this 4 values. But in this tutorial, we are going to learn space around, space between, and space evenly. So let's back to the practical. Here you can see our grid container height is 750 pixels. So I'm going to type this property name, which is align content. And our first value is center. If I save this file, here you can see the result. If I turn off my developer mode, now you can see it clearly. As you can see, it vertically centered our content. Similarly, if I use end value and then save the file, now you can see it put our grid structure end of this content. And as you know, start is our default value. But now I'm going to use a value named space between. So I'm going to type space between. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Here you can see it put our first grid item and our last grid item end to end. And here you can see the spaces between all the grid items. So this is the use case of space between value. So let's jump into our next value, which is space around. So I'm going to type space around. If I save this file, now you can see the result. This value going to provide the space top of the content and bottom of the content. Suppose it provide 10 pixel space top of this grid item, and it also going to provide 10 pixel space bottom of this item. And then come grid gap area, and once again top of this third item, it provide 10 pixel space. So in that way, it's work. And our last value is space evenly. So I'm going to type space evenly. So if I save this file, here you can see it provide same amount of space top and bottom of this item. So this is the use case of these values. Let me show you one thing. Here you can see we span our column 10 2 times. So I'm going to remove the grid column property from item 10. And now I'm going to span the item 7. So I'm going to paste it here. If I save this file, here you can see a gap. Here you can see an unfilled space. If you are working with complex grid structure, sometimes this kind of problems are awkward. And if you want to solve this kind of problem, we have another property, which is grid auto flow. Let me show you. So I'm going to type grid auto flow. As you know, we have total 2 types of flow, row wise and column wise. So I'm going to use row wise. If I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. But if I use another value with this, let me show you. So I'm going to use a new value, which is dense. If I save this file, here you can see it put our 8 grid item in the blank space. If we use this value, then it's not going to unfill the blank space. So I hope now it's clear for you what is grid tracking. In this tutorial, we are going to learn autofill and autofit property. Using these properties, we can control grid width. So let's start the practical and see how it's works. Here you can see side by side I open my Visual Studio Code editor and my browser using Live Server extension, and I already created a HTML document. And here you can see a container, and inside the container we have total 4 grid items. And as you can see, our container width is 700 pixels. And we use display grid property. And now I'm going to set width and height to these items. For now, I want to use 2 columns with 1FR value. So I'm going to use grid template column property, and I'm going to use repeat value. Repeat 2, comma with 1 FR value. If I save this file, you can see the result. And also I'm going to provide height to our row. So I'm going to use grid template column row property. And once again I'm going to use repeat value. 2 rows with 150 pixel height. If I save this file, you can see the result. Suppose I don't want to use fraction value, so I'm going to type 100 pixel. If I save this file, now you can see the result. Now our column width is 100 pixel. With that, I want to show 3 columns in our row. If I save this file, you can see the result. And now I want to adjust our 4th grid item in this place. For this, we need to use 2 values, autofill and autofit. Let me show you. So in this place, I'm going to type autofill. If I save this file, you can see the result. It automatically set our 4th grid item after the 3rd grid item. Similarly, if I use the autofit value, let me show you, and save this file, here you can see there is no changes. But there is a basic difference. If I use autofill value, it's going to create extra track. Let me show you. So I'm going to type autofill once again. And if I turn on my developer toolbar and click on this grid icon, here you can see there is a space for 3 grid items. Because our container width is 700 pixel and we set our grid item width 100 pixel. That's why we have a space for 3 grid items. But if I use autofit value, let me show you, and then set this file, and then turn on my grid lines, here you can see it do not create extra track lines. It creates the track according to the grid items. Suppose I want to shift our 4th column end of this container. So I'm going to use grid column end value. Grid column end. And I'm going to set position -1. If I save this file, here you can see there is no changes. Because autofit property doesn't create extra track. But if I use autofill property, let me show you. And then save this file, now you can see the result. And if I turn on the grid lines, now you can see it clearly. Because autofill property create extra column, that's why we can move our 4th grid item at end of this container. So this is the main difference between autofill and autofit value. And now I'm going to use min max function for our column. So I'm going to remove this one and save this file. And first I'm going to type autofit, and then I'm going to use min max function. I want to set minimum container width is 150 pixel and maximum up to 1 FR value. If I save this file, you can see the result. But what happened if I reduce the container width? So I'm going to type 70% container width. If I save this file, here you can see our 4th grid item shrink down. And if I show you my computer section, here you can see now our container width is 546 pixel. And we set our minimum item width 150 pixel. And if we multiply 150 pixel with 4, it's going to return 600 pixel. And as you already know, our container width below than 600 pixel, that's why it shrink down our 4th grid item. And if I increase the container width, let me show you. Now you can see it set our 4th grid item in our first row. And if I show you my container width, here you can see it's above 600 pixel. That's why it fit into this row. And similarly, if I show you my grid item width, here you can see our grid item width is 167 pixel. We cannot reduce our grid item width below than 150 pixel. And if we try to reduce our grid item width forcefully, let me show you. Here you can see it shrink our grid item in the second row. And if we try to reduce more, here you can see it's also shrink our 3rd grid item in the second row. Because we cannot reduce the grid item width below than 150 pixel. So without using media query, just using autofit value, we perfectly create our container responsive. Similarly, if I increase the browser width, here you can see all the grid item in a single row. And if you notice, you can see it also increased the item width. Now the item width is 245 pixel. If you want to show all the grid item in a single row, then you should have 600 pixel minimum container width. And if I reduce browser width too much and increase the container width percentage, something 85%, and also I'm going to increase the minimum width, so I'm going to increase it up to 300 pixel. If I save this file, now you can see total 4 row. So now it's look like total responsive. And as you can see, we set height for 2 rows, 150 pixel height. I hope now the concept is clear for you what is autofill value and autofit value. In this tutorial, we are going to learn a new property related CSS Grid, which is Fit-Content. So let's see how we can use it practically. Here you can see, side by side, I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already created a HTML document named index.html. Here you can see, inside the parent container, we have total 6 grid items. Basically, Fit-Content property working like max width property. So let's use this property. So I'm going to remove the previous one. And I'm going to type, suppose I want to show 2 columns using Fit-Content. So I'm going to type Fit-Content and inside the parenthesis, and I'm going to say 200 pixel maximum width for our first column. And similarly, for our second column, I'm going to use Fit-Content property. And for our second column, I'm going to use 400 pixel max width. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Here you can see for first column, we take 200 pixel width. And for second column, we take 400 pixel width. But if you notice, you can see our item width is according to content size. Let's take another column with 1 FR value. So I'm going to type 1 FR. If I save this file, you can see the result. If we set fit content value, we cannot extend our column more than 200 pixel. Similarly, we cannot extend our second column more than 400 pixel. Let's add some content in our first item. So inside the first item, I'm going to type lorem 30. If I save this file, here you can see the result. If I turn on my grid lines and show you my cell width, here you can see our first grid item extend up to 200 pixel. If we use fit content property, we cannot extend width more than 200 pixel. Similarly, if I add more content in our second grid item, let me show you, and then save the file, here you can see the result. If I show you my cell size, here you can see it extend up to 400 pixel, not more than 400 pixel. Because we set maximum width of this grid cell using fit content property. And for our third column, we use fraction value. So it can change its size according to the content. Basically, this technique is very useful for image gallery. Also, you can notice we cannot see the whole content in this item. For this, we can use min max function in our rows. Let me show you. So I'm going to remove this one and I'm going to set min max. Inside the parenthesis, here we can set minimum height for our grid item. I want to set 200 pixel minimum height. And then if you want to extend the grid cell height according to the content, for that you can use main content function. Let me show you. min dash content. If I set this file, here you can see the result. Now it's look perfect. We learned about main content property in our previous tutorials. So I hope now you understand what is the use case of fit content property. In this tutorial, we are going to learn a new grid item positioning property, which is order property. So let's see how we can use this property. As you can see, side by side, I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already created a HTML document named index.html. Here you can see inside my parent container, we have total 6 grid items. So using order property, we can change grid cell position. Suppose you want to move first grid cell in 6th position. For this, you can use order property. In our previous tutorials, we learned about positioning. But in this tutorial, we are going to position our cells using order property. Suppose I want to move the item 1 in 6th position. For this, I'm going to jump into the item 1 selector and I'm going to use order property. Order. And here I'm going to pass one value. If I save this file, here you can see It automatically move our content in the last position. Ordering start from opposite direction. That's why it's come to the last place. And similarly, if I use 0 value and then save the file, here you can see there is no changes in order. 0 is the default value of this property. But if I pass order 2 and then save the file, here you can see it's also come to the first place because there is no order 1. Suppose now I want to move our second item in first order. For that, I'm going to jump into the item to selector and I'm going to type order property. Order 1. If I save this file, here you can see the result. Now, this is our order 1 position. Now, suppose I want to move the fourth item in third position. Let's jump into the fourth selector and I'm going to type order 3. If I save this file, now you can see the result. This is our order 1 position and this is our order 2 position and this is our order 3 position. First we order our item 1 in second position. So it's come to the second position. And then we order our item 2 in first position. So it's come to the first position. And then we order our fourth item in third position. And you can see the result. It's come to the third position. And as you can see, we do not work with third item, fifth item and sixth item. So it has came forward. Suppose now you want to move the third item behind the fourth item. So I'm going to use order property once again. Order and I'm going to pass 4 value. If I save this file, you can see the result. Now you can see our third item came to the 6th position because we use 4 value. So our first order position is this one. And this is our second order position. And this is our third order position. And this is our fourth order position. So now it's clear for you how it's work. In this tutorial, we are going to learn about nested grids. So let's try to understand what is nested grid. Here you can see a grid container. And inside this grid container, we have total 6 grid cells. Now you decide to add more grid cells inside this grid cell. Then you need to convert this grid cell into a grid container. And then you can add more grid cell inside this container. Something like that. And we call this whole system nested grids. Using nested grid, we can convert a parent grid cell into a grid container. So let's start the practical and see how we can create it. As you can see, side by side, I open my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Live Server extension. And I already created a HTML document named index.html. As you can see in my parent container, I have 4 grid cells. And now I want to add more grid cell inside the 4th grid cell. For this, we need to use display grid property for item 4. So inside the item 4th selector, I'm going to use display property. Display grid. Now it converts our cell into a grid container. Now we can add more grid cell inside this container. Let me show you. So I'm going to remove this text and inside this div, I'm going to create 4 more div. Div dot sub sub1 and I'm going to duplicate this line 3 times. And also I'm going to numbering their class name sub2, sub3 and sub4. And inside these grid cells, I'm going to type capital A, capital B, capital C and capital D. If I save this file, you can see the result. So as you can see, we create 4 grid cells inside the 4th container. And now I'm going to assign width to our cells. For this, I'm going to use grid template column property. Grid template columns. And I want to assign 2 columns with 1 FR value. 1 FR. 1 FR. If I save this file, you can see the result. Let's set a background color to this div, otherwise it's not going to be visible. So I'm going to select item 4. Inside the item 4, I'm going to select all the divs. Then inside the curly braces, background red. If I save this file, you can see the result. And as you can see, there is no gap between these cells. So I'm going to use grid gap property. Grid gap 10 pixel. If I save this file, now you can see the cells clearly. So as you can see, inside a parent grid container, we have total 4 cells. And then we convert our 4th grid cell into a grid container. And inside this container, we also have 4 grid cells. And we call this process nested grid. Using this, inside a grid item, we can insert more grid items. And also you can insert more grid items inside these subgrid items. Suppose you want to insert 4 more grid items inside this cell A. Then once again, you need to follow this similar procedure. First, you need to use display property grid for this cell. And then you can add more grid item inside this cell. And if I show you my developer toolbar, here you can see inside this grid we have another grid structure. And you can see the grid lines of this grid structure. And if I show you my layout section, here you can see in grid overlays we have total 2 grid system. Our main container grid system and next our overlay grid item system. And you can turn off and turn on your grid lines according to your choice. So thanks for watching this video. I hope now it's clear for you what is nested grid. Stay tuned for our next tutorial.
So this is the last tutorial related CSS Grid, where we are going to learn overlapping grid items. So let's see what is that.
Here you can see a grid container, and inside this grid container we have total 3 grid items. And as you can see, items are overlapping each other, and we called it overlapping grid items. And now you want to green one came first, something like that. So let's see how we can create the overlapping grid items. With that, we are going to learn how we can change the stack order of these grid items. Stack order means Z index. So let's start the practical and try to understand how it's work. Here you can see side by side I opened my Visual Studio Code Editor and my browser using Lifesaver extension. And I already created a HTML document named index.html. And as you can see, I already created a grid structure. And there are 3 grid items in this grid structure. And as you can see, our container width is 400 pixels. And our column width is 200 pixels. And also our row height is 200 pixels. So let's try to overlap the grid items. At first, I want to span our red grid item. I want to span it up to 2 columns. For this, I'm going to use grid column property. 1 from column 1 to span 2. If I save this file, you can see the result. We span our item 2 columns. And also I'm going to span this item row wise with 2 columns. Let me show you. So I'm going to use grid row property. Grid row. From row 1, span up to row 2. If I save this file, you can see the result. So now our first item span up to 2 columns and 2 rows. And our second item and third item is our implicit grid items. And now I'm going to assign a maximum width all of these grid items. As you know, we use this item class all of these grid items. So I'm going to use max width property. So I'm going to type max width 200 pixels. If I save this file, you can see the result. And now I'm going to align our first cell vertically. So I'm going to type align self start. If I save this file, you can see the result. And if I show you my grid lines, here you can see it's take full area. Because we use align cell property, that's why it's look like smaller. If I comment out this property and save this file, you can see the result. But to create a overlapping grid items, we need it. So I'm going to undo the comment and save this file. And now I want to move our second item center of this page. For this, I'm going to use same properties for item 2. If I paste the code and save the file, here you can see it overlap our first grid item. But I want to place it middle. So I'm going to use align cell property. Align cell center. If I save this file, you can see the result. We vertically align our item center of this container. And now I'm going to horizontally center this grid item. For this, I'm going to use justify self property. Justify self center. If I save this file, you can see the result. And for our third grid item, I'm going to use same property. but I want to align our content end of this container. So I'm going to use align self end and also justify self end. If I save this file, you can see the result. I don't need this orange background color, so I'm going to remove it. Now all the grid items are take same amount of area. We just align the items start, center and end, but their column size and position is same. And now I'm going to add some text in all the items. So in item 1, I'm going to type lorem 15. It's going to add 15 word character. It can add 15 word paragraph in our item. And I'm going to copy the paragraph and I'm going to paste it in our second item, also in our third item. If I save this file, you can see the result. Hey, we need to add more character to overlap this item. So I'm going to paste this character once again. If I save this file, now you can see it's overlap each other. And now I'm going to show you how can we change the stack order of this item. To change stack order, we need to use our old property, which is z-index. So now I want to bring the first item to the forefront. For this, I'm going to use z-index property. So I'm going to type z-index 1. If I save this file, you can see the result. You can see it came on top. And now I want to bring the orange item top of the all. For this, we need to use z-index 2 value. So I'm going to type z-index 2. If I save this file, you can see the result. So now it's clear for you how we can control the overlap areas. Now let's see if I remove all the alignment of this container and then save the file. Here you can see the result. Now all the grid items are still exist in the same place. And now I want to show our green grid item. For this, we need to use z-index value once again. z-index 3. If I save this file, you can see the result. I hope now it's clear your doubt about overlapping. So thanks for watching this video. Stay tuned for our next tutorial.